Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going all the way back to 17th century England. It was a pretty wild time. Lots of political and religious upheaval. We're going to be looking at some excerpts that focus on John Locke's second treatise of government. And we're going to tie that in with the Glorious Revolution, especially for those of you out there who are getting ready for the UPSC exams. And those of you who are focusing on international relations, this is going to be a great deep dive for you guys. Because, understanding Locke and his ideas and how those ideas had a global impact, that's really important. It can help you answer those tricky IR questions that tend to come up.
Yeah, what's really fascinating about this period in history is how it really laid the groundwork for the democracies we see today. And those very principles are governing international relations today. So we're going to
Right.
kind of dissect how Locke's ideas were born from a specific historical context and how they actually became so foundational to modern political thought.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Imagine England in the 1600s. Like, what's going on? Well, there's the English Civil War, you've got the execution of King Charles I, and then after all that, you have the restoration of the monarchy. It was just this constant back and forth, like a tug-of-war between the monarchy and parliament.
Yeah, and to make things even more complicated, you also had a succession crisis brewing. So Charles II, who was a Protestant king, he had a Catholic brother named James II. James was next in line for the throne. And this was a big deal in England because it was a predominantly Protestant nation. This caused a lot of anxiety and tension.
Right, I can imagine. So that's where John Locke comes in. He's often called like the father of liberalism. But his path to becoming like this champion of individual rights and limited government was actually kind of interesting.
Oh yeah, for sure. Locke started off as a right-wing monarchist. He even agreed with some of Thomas Hobbes's ideas. Hobbes argued for a strong absolute ruler. But then Locke met the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a leading Whig figure, and that seems to have been like a real turning point for him.
So how did meeting Shaftesbury change Locke's political thinking? Like, it seems like a pretty big shift to go from supporting a strong monarchy to like becoming this advocate for individual liberties and limited government.
Yeah, it is a big change. And honestly, that's where things get really interesting. Historians still debate the specifics. But it's clear that Shaftesbury's Whig ideology really influenced Locke. The Whigs favored a stronger parliament and a more constrained monarchy.
Okay, so Locke basically started to echo those ideas.
Exactly. He became really important in articulating and refining Whig principles, and ultimately he became one of their most powerful voices.
Okay, so we've got Locke in his second treatise. And it's often seen as like a direct justification for the Glorious Revolution, back in 1688 when James II was replaced by William of Orange and Mary. But some scholars, like Laslett and Cranston, they say that Locke actually wrote the two treatises earlier. So why is it the timing of when the two treatises were written such a big deal?
Well, the timing is really important because it affects how we understand Locke's intentions. If he wrote them earlier, it suggests that he might have been pushing for a more radical change in England's political system. Like he might have even been calling for Charles II to be removed from power. Or maybe he was laying the groundwork for a revolution that could happen in the future. Imagine writing something like that back then. With the monarchy holding so much power, it was a pretty bold move.
Right, that definitely makes things more complicated. But then there's Ashcraft, who offers a slightly different perspective.
Right. Ashcraft sees the second treatise as this blend of radical and moderate ideas. He thinks Locke's arguments were maybe even more radical than what the mainstream Whigs were saying at the time.
So he was pushing things even further than the Whigs.
Yeah. This interpretation challenges the idea that Locke was just reflecting what everyone else was already thinking. Instead, he might have been actively trying to make bigger changes to how power was distributed, even bigger than what some of the Whigs wanted.
So we have this ongoing debate. Was Locke's second treatise a direct response to the Glorious Revolution? Or was it more like a precursor to it? So for our listeners, especially for those of you studying for the UPSC, the important thing to remember is that historical texts often have multiple interpretations.
Exactly. And for the UPSC, it's so important to be able to analyze different viewpoints, to evaluate the evidence, and then
Oh,
come to your own conclusions.
yeah, it's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding the nuances, the debates, and all the things that make history so complex.
Yeah. And this is especially relevant for international relations, the ideas that came about during this time, especially the ones Locke wrote about. They had a huge impact all over the world, understanding this context. It's crucial for understanding how modern nation states and international systems developed.
Okay, so to wrap up this part of the deep dive, we've got a politically charged England on the verge of some major changes. We've got Locke, who may or may not have been calling for a revolution. And we've got his second treatise, which continues to spark debates among scholars even today. Now let's shift our focus to the main event, the Glorious Revolution itself.
Okay, so the Glorious Revolution. It wasn't just about swapping out one monarch for another. It actually completely changed the power structure in England. You see James II, with his pro-Catholic views and the birth of his Catholic heir, well, he reignited those fears of a Catholic dynasty ruling over a mostly Protestant country. This led some of the Protestant leaders to invite William of Orange. He was married to James II's Protestant daughter, Mary. They invited William to take over the throne.
So it was more of a planned transition of power than a violent overthrow. But how did this shift actually play out? Like, what were the lasting effects of this so-called Glorious Revolution?
Well, one of the biggest outcomes was the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This document laid out some really important principles that would go on to influence democratic movements around the world. It basically redefined the relationship between the monarch and parliament, and it established that parliament was supreme. This is a really important moment, not just in English history, but in the evolution of modern political thought.
Okay, so talking about global impact, what parts of the Bill of Rights had such a big impact?
Well, think about things like free elections and freedom of speech within Parliament. The fact that the monarch couldn't suspend laws without Parliament's okay, and no more cruel and unusual punishments. These were radical ideas back then.
Yeah.
And they totally challenged the idea of an absolute monarchy.
So it was a step towards what we might call a constitutional monarchy today, where the monarch's power is limited by laws and a representative body.
Exactly. And these concepts really line up with Locke's ideas, even if historians still debate how much he directly influenced the Bill of Rights, his second treatise. With its focus on natural rights, the social contract, and the right to resist tyranny, well, it provided a really strong philosophical framework for understanding and justifying these changes.
Like, even if Locke wasn't literally there when they wrote the Bill of Rights, his ideas were still kind of floating around in the air.
Yeah, I like that. His work captured the feeling of the time, this growing sense that individual rights and liberties needed to be protected from anyone in power who might abuse that power.
This makes me think about how we study history, especially for exams like the UPSC. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the deeper ideas, these ideological shifts that shape events.
Absolutely. If you're preparing for the UPSC, you need to be able to connect political philosophy with historical events. It's about understanding how ideas lead to actions and how actions lead to ideas. That's what makes a good IR answer. It's not just describing things, it's about analyzing them.
It's really cool to see how these ideas that seem so abstract can have real consequences in the world.
Oh, definitely.
Can you give us an example of how the Bill of Rights changed things in England?
Sure. One example is that the monarch couldn't just raise taxes whenever they wanted or keep a standing army without Parliament's approval. This was a huge change. It limited the monarch's power to just do whatever they wanted.
So it created this system of checks and balances to stop any one person or group from becoming too powerful.
Exactly. It created accountability. Decisions had to be made through deliberation and with everyone's consent.
That must have been a huge change for the people of England. Going from a system where the monarch had all the power to a system where their power was limited.
It was a big change. But it wasn't easy. There were still people who believed in the divine right of kings. They saw the Glorious Revolution as a betrayal. But things were changing. The idea of constitutionalism had taken root.
It's amazing how one event can trigger such massive changes that last for centuries. So how did these changes in England affect the rest of the world?
The Glorious Revolution and the principles in the Bill of Rights. They became a model for other countries. Think about the American Revolution almost 100 years later. The American colonists were inspired by Locke's ideas and by what happened in England. The idea of individual rights and the right to revolt. Those ideas spread across the Atlantic.
So even though we're focusing on Locke in England, it's important to remember that these events had global implications. This idea of a nation-state, with a government that's accountable to its people, a system based on individual rights and limited power. It all has its roots in this period of English history.
You're absolutely right. And for UPSC students, especially those of you focused on international relations, making those connections is super important. Understanding how these ideas started and how they spread, it helps us understand the world we live in today.
It seems like Locke's second treatise, even if he didn't intend it to be a blueprint for revolution, well, it became a really important text for people who wanted to challenge absolute power and fight for individual liberty.
Yeah, I agree. Locke's ideas. Even though they've been debated and reinterpreted over the years, they gave people a powerful way to talk about change. His writings became part of a bigger conversation about what government should be, about the rights of citizens, and about the limits of power.
So to really understand how important Locke was, I think we need to look closer at his ideas about the state of nature and the social contract. These concepts might seem a bit abstract, but they're really key to understanding his political philosophy.
Yeah, let's break those down a bit. So Locke's idea of the state of nature. It's not about a time when humans actually lived without any social structures. It's more like a thought experiment. What would life be like without government or laws?
So it's like a what-if scenario,
Well,
trying to figure out what human nature is really like
yeah,
and why we need government in the first place.
exactly. And Locke argued that even in this hypothetical state of nature, people would still be governed by natural law.
Okay. Natural law. What exactly does that mean? It sounds kind of mystical.
Yeah. It's not as mystical as it sounds. Locke believed that natural law is this set of rights and duties that apply to every human being, just because they're human. These rights exist whether or not there's a government or any man-made laws.
So it's like a universal moral code that
Yeah.
goes beyond any specific culture or society.
Exactly. And Locke believed that these natural laws included the right to life, liberty, and property. He argued that these rights aren't given to us by a ruler or a government. We have them because we're human.
Okay. And this is where the social contract comes in, right? It's like the bridge between this hypothetical state of nature and the formation of governments.
Exactly. Locke argued that people choose to leave the state of nature, and they form governments to better protect their natural rights. It's like an agreement. Individuals give up some of their absolute freedom in exchange for the safety and benefits of living in an organized society.
So we're trading some autonomy for collective security and well-being.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. And Locke believed that this agreement, the social contract, it wasn't set in stone. If a government didn't hold up its end of the bargain, like if it became tyrannical or took away people's natural rights, then the people had the right to resist, even to overthrow that government.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
hmm
Especially back in the 17th century. It challenges this whole idea of just blindly obeying authority.
It was a radical idea. Locke's ideas about the social contract and the right of revolution, they paved the way for what we now call popular sovereignty, the idea that governments get their legitimacy from the consent of the people they govern.
And this idea has had such a huge impact on how democracy has evolved. And it still shapes how we think about the role of government and the rights of citizens.
Absolutely. And for those of you studying for the UPSC, understanding these core concepts of Locke's philosophy is essential. It's not just about knowing history. It's about understanding the intellectual foundations of modern political systems.
It's incredible to think that these ideas, written so long ago, are still relevant today.
I know it's the power of ideas. They transcend time and place, they shape history, and they continue to influence how we think about politics and society.
And speaking of relevance, let's talk about how Locke's ideas apply to the 21st century. How do his theories about individual liberty, limited government, and the social contract connect with the issues we're facing today?
It's like Locke's ideas are everywhere we look these days. Like all these debates about things like government surveillance and data privacy and, even freedom of speech in the digital age, it all goes back to those fundamental questions Locke was wrestling with centuries ago.
Yeah, it's true. This tension between individual liberty and the power of the government, it feels more relevant than ever, especially now that we're all so connected.
Right. I mean, we might not have to worry about a Catholic monarchy taking over like they did back in 17th century England, but the basic dilemmas are the same. How much power should the government have, and how do we protect individual rights, especially as technology keeps changing and there are these security concerns?
It's like Locke was way ahead of his time. Like he could see all these modern day challenges coming.
He was definitely onto something.
So let's circle back to that debate about when Locke actually wrote the two treatises. Why are scholars still arguing about the timing?
It's a real historical mystery. Some people think Locke wrote the two treatises as a direct response to the Glorious Revolution, and then others think he wrote them much earlier, maybe as a way to encourage people to oppose Charles II, or even as like a theoretical roadmap for a future revolution.
So it's a tough one to crack. What's the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this debate, especially those who are studying for the UPSC?
The main thing is to remember that understanding the context of any historical text is so important. When was it written? What was happening politically and socially at the time? Who was the author writing for? Asking these questions can totally change how we understand a text. It can change what we think the text means. And what the author was trying to do.
It's like trying to get a joke, but you don't know any of the inside jokes or references. The same words can have totally different meanings.
Yeah, exactly.
So we can't just read historical texts like they're just words on a page. We have to remember that they were written in a specific time and place, and that they reflect the debates, the worries, and the hopes of that time.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really interesting journey through 17th century England. We've explored the ideas of John Locke and those incredible events of the Glorious Revolution. It's clear that Locke had a huge impact, not just on English history, but on the development of Western political thought as a whole.
And for our listeners getting ready for the UPSC, especially those focusing on international relations, the key is to make those connections. See how Locke's ideas about natural rights and limited government and the social contract. See how those ideas have echoed throughout history. They've influenced revolutions. They've shaped constitutional documents. And they've even played a role in the development of international law.
It's amazing to see how these big philosophical ideas can lead to real changes in the world.
It really is. And as you keep studying international relations, you'll see these echoes of history everywhere. The ideas from this period, they're still shaping debates about things like sovereignty and human rights and the use of force. They're shaping how we think about the entire international system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to encourage all of you to stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep exploring these ideas.
And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into history, politics, and all sorts of big ideas. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, it really is amazing how these big philosophical ideas can end up having such a real impact on the world.
Absolutely.
And as you delve deeper into IR, you'll find that these echoes of history are kind of everywhere. The ideas that emerged during this period in England, they continue to shape debates about sovereignty, human rights, the use of force, really the very structure of the international system.
So it's not just ancient history. It's like the foundation for so much of what we're dealing with today.
So to wrap up this deep dive into John Locke and the Glorious Revolution, what are some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those prepping for the UPSC exam?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that Locke's ideas have had this incredible staying power. His arguments for natural rights, limited government, the social contract, these have resonated across centuries. They've influenced revolutions, they've shaped constitutions, and they've even helped to shape international law.
So Locke's thinking wasn't just confined to 17th century England. It's had this ripple effect throughout history.
Exactly. And for those of you studying international relations, it's crucial to understand those connections, to see how those ideas traveled, how they were adopted and adapted in different contexts. It helps us make sense of the world we live in today.
And it reminds us that ideas really do matter. They can shape the course of history.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
I always learn so much from these conversations.
Me too.
We've explored a turbulent period in English history. We've unpacked John Locke's second treatise, and we've seen how those events and ideas continue to shape our world today.
It's a reminder that history is never really past. It's always with us in some way.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep learning.
And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating explorations of history, politics, and ideas. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.